Beneath modern Rome, beneath the traffic, the tourists, the ordinary hum of the city, there is another kind of place entirely, a place built on silence. It is not a tomb, but it keeps the dead. It is not a library in the usual sense, but it contains more human stories than almost anywhere else on earth. This is the memory vault of the Western world, a vast, quiet body of paper and ink that has been growing for more than 12 centuries. It is the central nervous system of an institution that understands itself as eternal, and like any memory, it preserves not only triumphs and grace, but regret, compromise, and the things people would rather leave behind. The scale of it is almost impossible to feel. The official figure sounds tidy enough, 85 kilometers of shelving. But that number is too sterile to mean much on its own. Think of it this way. If you walked the length of those shelves, you would cover roughly the distance from Paris to the edge of Orléans. The collection begins in the 8th century and continues, decision by decision, breath by breath, into the present. The catalogue alone holds more than 35,000 volumes. This is not just a collection. It is a compressed layer of human history, pressed into parchment and paper, waiting in cool, controlled darkness. And what, exactly, sits on those shelves? Almost everything. The excommunication of Martin Luther, the papal bull that divided the New World between Spain and Portugal, a letter from Mary, Queen of Scots, written only days before her execution, King Henry VIII's request for an annulment, stretched across a magnificent scroll of parchment, its seals still hanging intact, but it also holds the ordinary machinery of history, account books, petitions from villages long forgotten, reports from missionaries in places that no longer exist under the names they once had. It is the raw paperwork of power, faith, ambition, fear, and weakness, preserved in the trembling hand of a desperate pope or the assured flourish of a king. For centuries, a place like this has done what places like this always do. It has fed the imagination. It has become the starting point for 1,000 conspiracy theories. What is the Vatican hiding? The true bloodline of Christ? Proof of extraterrestrial contact? Lost knowledge of the Knights Templar? The popular story is always the same. Somewhere in the dark, the Church is guarding a single secret so explosive it could split the world in two. But that is exactly where the investigation has to start, because the simple answer is very often the most comforting one, and here, comfort is misleading. The reality buried beneath all that paper is more tangled than the myth, and perhaps more unsettling. The real question is not what secret the archive contains, but why it hides at all. What if the point is not to conceal one clean, villainous truth, but to keep us away from a truth that is painfully difficult to hold in the mind? A truth in which the Church appears not as a seamless divine machine, but as a fragile, frightened, deeply human institution making impossible choices under pressure. The formal name today is the Vatican Apostolic Archive, but for most of its history, it was known by a name that seems to promise exactly the thing people most want to find, the Archivum Secretum, the secret archive. And the first real question is simpler than it looks. What did that word actually mean? The name itself is the first lock, Archivum Secretum Vaticanum, the Vatican Secret Archive. For generations, that middle word, secretum, has fueled a global industry of suspicion. It sounds like conspiracy. It sounds like forbidden knowledge. It sounds like the sort of word that belongs on a locked door at the end of a corridor no one is meant to enter. But this is the first lesson the archive teaches. Here, words often do not mean what modern ears assume they mean. In medieval Latin, secretum did not primarily mean secret, in the modern sense of hidden, clandestine, or concealed from everyone. It meant something closer to separate, private, reserved. The Archivum Secretum was, in its original sense, the Pope's private archive. His correspondence, his diplomatic records, the administrative memory of his office, documents held apart for his use and for the use of his administration, separate from the public records of other Vatican departments. And this is not just a convenient reinterpretation after the fact. In 2019, Pope Francis formally changed the name. It is now the Vatican Apostolic Archive. His stated reason was simple: to end the misunderstanding modern languages had attached to the word secret, the suggestion of darkness, plots, and hidden conspiracies. Still, fairness matters here. For a place that insists it was never secret in the conspiratorial sense, It has been remarkably difficult to enter. The legend of total inaccessibility is exaggerated, but only partly. For centuries, the archive really was sealed. It was only in 1881 that Pope Leo XIII cautiously opened it to carefully vetted scholars. Even now, entry is a privilege, not a right. You move through permissions and restrictions. You cannot wander the stacks. You do not browse. You request specific documents by number, and then you wait. The reading rooms are silent in a way that feels almost engineered. The sentries do not just surround you there, they press on you, so the first lock turns out to be linguistic, a misunderstanding, a historical shift in meaning. But that only brings us to the more difficult question underneath it. If the archive is not hiding aliens, lost gospels, or the Holy Grail, then what is it protecting? Why 85 kilometers of guarded paper? Why the slow release of knowledge, decade after decade, file after file? And that leads to the central working hypothesis of this investigation. The archive is not defending a lie, it is defending a truth that is much more dangerous to the institution. Not because it is spectacular, but because it is human. What sits in those files is not one neat revelation. It is a record of compromise, fear, calculation, doubt, factional struggle, and moral failure, placed right beside acts of faith, courage, and astonishing charity. What the Vatican has often kept out of sight is not proof that it was secretly demonic. It is evidence that it was, and remains, painfully, tragically, and inconveniently human. And for an institution built on the claim of a divine and unchanging foundation, that may be the most dangerous truth of all. It suggests that faith is not a fortress. It is a ship, fragile and exposed, crossing a dark historical sea, and this archive is its logbook. So it is worth being clear about what kind of journey this is. We are not here for easy answers. The files in this archive rarely provide the comfort of clean heroes and villains. What they offer instead is something harder, and in some ways more valuable. The texture of reality. The desperation inside a king's letter. The political calculation in a cardinal's note. The slight tremor in a signature that settled the fate of thousands. This is not a search for judgment. It is a search for understanding. And before we go any deeper, one brief but necessary point. Work like this, the slow, quiet work of following difficult truths where they lead, only exists because there is an audience willing to stay with it. A simple like on this video is a real signal that complex stories still matter, and subscribing to the channel makes sure you do not miss where this path goes next. I am also always struck by the geography of shared curiosity. So if you have a moment, tell me in the comments what time it is where you are watching from. It is a small thing, but it gives shape to the global, silent room in which this conversation is happening. Thank you. Now let's begin. Not with a grand theory, not with speculation, but with a single physical object, a piece of parchment that sat misunderstood for nearly 700 years, a document that forces us to rethink one of the most famous betrayals in European history. So let us start at a precise moment in time. Friday, October the 13th, 1307. At dawn across the Kingdom of France, agents of King Philip IV move at once. They arrest thousands of men, from senior commanders to ordinary brothers, belonging to the most powerful military order in Christendom, the Knights Templar. The accusations are stunning: heresy, idolatry, spitting on the cross. What follows is now part of historical legend. Years of interrogation, confessions forced under pressure, and finally the smoke of execution pyres. In the standard version of the story, the Templars are crushed by state power, and Pope Clement V appears either as a weak accomplice or as a willing partner in their destruction. For almost 700 years that was the accepted account, a story of greed, betrayal, and a spectacular fall. It felt closed, sealed by the flames that consumed the last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay. Then, in 2001, a historian named Barbara Frail was working in the Vatican Archive. She was doing the kind of work historians actually do, moving patiently through enormous quantities of paper, following traces that most people would miss, and she found something that should not have been where it was. Not in a dramatic hidden chamber, not in some jeweled container. According to later reports, it had simply been misfiled. A clerical mistake, made centuries earlier, had hidden one of the most important documents of the medieval world in plain sight. What she found was a single large sheet of parchment, roughly 2 feet by 3, worn by age and damp but still legible. Hanging from the lower edge were the intact wax seals of the cardinals who'd conducted the inquiry. This was not a copy, not a later summary. It was the original record of a papal investigation into the leaders of the Templar Order, carried out in secret at the royal castle of Chinon in France. It is now known as the Chinon Parchment. That one object captures almost everything this archive is about. A preserved fragment of the past, sitting quietly in the dark, with the power to rearrange our picture of history. The standard account of the Templars depends on one central idea, that the Church condemned them. But this document is a direct record of the Pope's own representatives questioning the Templar leadership. And it suggests that the Vatican's judgment was not the same as the French king's at all. The real question is what the parchment actually says, and the answer, as so often happens here, is more complicated and more revealing than a simple verdict of guilt or innocence. The parchment itself does not look dramatic. It is just a large sheet of sheepskin, aged to the colour of old honey, covered in the dense looping hand of a 14th century clerk. But what it contains is the point at which a 700-year-old story begins to come apart. This is the Chinon Parchment, found in the archive in 2001 by Barbara Frail. And in the history of the Templars, it is the document that will not stay quiet. It is essentially a transcript. It records an inquiry held in the summer of 1308 at the castle of Chinon, where the highest-ranking Templars, including Jacques de Molay, were being held. Pope Clement V, under intense pressure from the King of France, sent a commission of cardinals to question them. The document confirms that the Templar leaders did confess to sins. They admitted to acts described as the denial of Christ and to irregular kisses during initiation rites. And in the popular retelling, that is where the story stops. Confession equals guilt. Case closed. But archives punish that kind of selective reading. You have to keep going, because after those confessions, very likely extracted through fear, and possibly worse, the document records that the Templars begged for and received absolution from the Pope's representatives. And here, precision matters. This is the heart of the whole issue. Absolution was not an acquittal, it was not a legal declaration of innocence. In the language of the Church, absolution is spiritual, not judicial. It is the forgiveness of sins granted to a penitent, restoring him to the sacraments and to a state of grace. Put simply, the Pope's envoys were telling the Templar leaders, your souls are reconciled with the Church. That one act breaks the simpler myth. The Pope did not see the Templars as irredeemable heretics at the centre of a satanic cult. He saw them as deeply compromised men within a Christian order, men who had sinned, repented, and could be forgiven. His position was not one of total annihilation. He was moving toward reform, not toward extermination. So why did this document remain buried in the archive? Why allow the world to believe for centuries that the Church had condemned the Templars as servants of evil? Because what follows is not a story of spiritual certainty. It is a story of political humiliation. Pope Clement was trapped by the geography of power. He was a French pope living in Avignon, and Philip IV was the strongest king in Europe. Philip did not want a reformed order. He wanted the Templars' wealth. And he wanted an armed, independent, transnational institution erased from his realm. The Chinon Parchment shows the Pope acting as a priest, trying to save souls. But it also reveals, by implication, his failure as a ruler. He could not save the order itself. He could not save the men from the king's machinery. The French crown ignored the subtler spiritual position taken by the Papal Commission and drove forward with its political endgame. 2 years after the absolution, the order was officially dissolved. 6 years after that, Jacques de Molay, the man whose soul had been reconciled with the Church, was burned in Paris as a relapsed heretic. The truth was too awkward, too revealing, too damaging to papal authority. It was easier for the institution to let history keep the cleaner version. Heretics were punished. Justice was done. The story is over. The archive did not conceal a hidden crime. It concealed a visible failure of power. And that pattern, the flattening of an uncomfortable historical reality into a cleaner, more dramatic public myth, is not unique to the Templars. We find it again in one of the Vatican's most famous collisions with the modern world. The Chinon Parchment forces a correction in a story about political betrayal. But elsewhere in the archive lie the records of another, even more famous conflict. One that was not about armies, money, or royal ambition, but about the structure of reality itself. The schoolbook version is powerful because it is so simple. Galileo Galilei, the old astronomer, is dragged before the Roman Inquisition and forced to deny what he knows to be true, that the earth moves around the sun. It is the perfect modern myth, the lonely genius against blind dogma, science against faith. But the paper trail, the letters, memoranda, and trial records points to something much more human, and for that reason much more difficult. The conflict was never as clean as the myth makes it sound. The Vatican's own astronomers had largely confirmed Galileo's observations. The problem was not just the science. It was a convergence of smaller forces, professional jealousy from rivals, Galileo's own proud and abrasive temperament, and a moment of broader instability in Italy, with plague and religious fracture, making the Church deeply suspicious of anything that could produce further disorder. At the centre of it all was authority. During the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Church was fighting to preserve its claim to be the ultimate interpreter of Scripture. And here was Galileo, not simply proposing a new model of the heavens, but telling theologians and cardinals how the Bible itself should be reread in light of his findings. In the eyes of the Inquisition, that was the deeper offence. His true crime was not astronomy. It was theology. He had crossed a boundary he was not supposed to cross. The archive does not just preserve the sentence handed down against him. It preserves the anatomy of an institutional mistake. It shows, in procedural ink and bureaucratic form, how an institution committed to divine truth could end up resisting a physical truth that was increasingly impossible to deny. And for any institution that claims proximity to the infallible, admitting error is never simple. It is slow, politically dangerous, and deeply destabilizing. The Church took more than 350 years to close that wound publicly. A commission was established in the 1980s. Only in 1992 did Pope John Paul II formally conclude the matter, describing it as a tragic mutual incomprehension. So what the Galileo files reveal is not a cartoonish war on science. They reveal an institution trapped inside its own logic of authority. Once that authority had been asserted, retreat became dangerous. And the fear of losing control pushed the Church into conflict with a truth that was, quite literally, visible in the sky. But the historical clashes of earlier centuries, dramatic as they are, remain insulated by distance. The actors are long dead. The passions have cooled. The archive, however, also preserves more recent wounds that still reach into living memory, and for more than half a century, one of the deepest of those wounds has been tied to one man, and to one unbearable question. His name was Eugenio Pacelli, Pope Pius XII, and for decades his legacy has stood under the shadow of the 20th century's greatest crime. The accusation is blunt, and it has echoed for generations, that while the Holocaust consumed the Jews of Europe, the Vicar of Christ remained silent, that he chose diplomacy over denunciation, caution over moral clarity. In its harshest form, the accusation gave him a title, Hitler's Pope. For more than 70 years the argument raged without access to the full record. The Vatican maintained that Pius had worked quietly behind the scenes, using private channels to save lives, and believing that a public condemnation would only provoke worse brutality. His defenders saw a man trapped in an impossible landscape, trying to do what could still be done. His critics saw a failure of moral courage on a historic scale. But both sides were arguing through gaps. The internal memoranda, the pleas, the reports, the calculations, all of it remained under seal in the archive of his pontificate. Then, in March of 2020, after decades of pressure from historians and Jewish organisations, Pope Francis opened the doors. Millions of pages from the pontificate of Pius XII were made available to scholars. Francis said the Church was not afraid of history. It was a major moment. For historians, it meant access to a time capsule from the centre of the Second World War. For the Church, it was a serious gamble. For the wider world, it looked like the beginning of a reckoning. At that point, the question was no longer speculative. It had become evidentiary. What would the files show? A secret collaborator? A frightened man paralysed by caution? Or a hidden rescuer whose work had been misunderstood? But what began to emerge from the newly opened archive did not support a clean answer. It revealed something harder to live with, a profound paradox: public silence, private action. For decades, the case against Pius XII rested largely on what is missing from the public record, on the silence itself. His wartime Christmas messages, for example, contain careful, universal references to victims of war. He spoke of hundreds of thousands who, solely because of their nationality or race, have been condemned to death or progressive extinction. But the wording remains wrapped in diplomatic haze. The Nazis are never named, the Jews are never named. And that caution becomes far heavier when set beside what the newly opened files confirm. The Vatican knew, and it knew early. Reports from diplomats, Jewish organizations and allied sources reached the Secretariat of State. A letter from 1942, emphasized by historians at Yad Vashem, shows that the Holy See had received reliable information about the mass murder of Jews in and around Lviv. The machinery of extermination was not hidden from them, and yet the great public denunciation never came. But this is the Vatican Archive, and what looks like silence in one set of documents is often answered by urgent activity somewhere else. While the Pope's public language remained measured, orders and instructions moved through quieter channels. The files reveal a broad clandestine effort. Directions, often oral or passed through trusted intermediaries, were sent to convents, monasteries, seminaries, and other church institutions. Open your doors, hide them. The scale of that effort, especially in Rome, was significant. According to the records, more than 150 religious houses and Vatican properties in Rome, along with locations at Castel Gandolfo, sheltered several thousand Jews during the Nazi occupation of the city. Behind walls meant for prayer and silence, monks and nuns risked their lives for people they did not know. The archive also preserves dispatches from papal nuncios in Hungary, Slovakia, Romania and elsewhere, men trying through diplomacy and delay to slow deportations and save whoever could still be saved. So the archive leaves us with two portraits that do not sit comfortably together. On one side, a public figure who refused to speak with the clarity the moment demanded. On the other, a hidden administrator overseeing channels that helped save thousands. One man, in two bodies of paperwork, becomes two different figures, the silent pope and the secret rescuer. How can both portraits be true at once? That is where the historical argument becomes fierce and often bitter. And this is precisely where the archive performs its most difficult function. It does not deliver a final verdict. Instead, the newly opened files have intensified an already painful dispute. The argument now is not only about silence, but about the logic behind it. Historians digging through the same archive have arrived at two major interpretations, and they do not reconcile easily. One school of thought, represented by historians such as David Kurtzer, argues that the documents confirm a story of institutional self-preservation. They point to internal memoranda saturated with caution, to fear of Nazi retaliation against the Vatican itself, and to a geopolitical mindset in which atheistic communism appeared to many church leaders as the greater long-term threat. In this reading, silence was not chosen for the sake of the Jews, it was chosen for the sake of the institution. The church protected itself, and moral witness was the price. Public silence, on this view, was a grave moral failure shaped by fear and calculation. Another group of scholars and archivists, including Johann Ix, looks at a different set of papers from the same years and reaches almost the opposite conclusion. In their reading, a public denunciation would have been not brave, but catastrophic. It would have been useless and harmful. It would have provoked a violent Nazi response and shut down the very networks the church was using to hide, move, and protect people. They point to monastery shelters, baptismal certificates, discreet funding, and hidden rescue channels. In that interpretation, the silence was terrible but strategic. Pius was not a coward. He was a pragmatist making an unbearable choice. Quiet effectiveness over noble public speech that might have changed little and endangered much. So the archive does not give us one truth. It gives us two truths that remain at war with one another. The files support both the moral indictment and the pragmatic defense. The dispute is no longer about whether the Vatican knew. The evidence makes clear that it knew a great deal. The real dispute is about what that knowledge required and what the institution believed it could afford to do. The documents reveal a body that was at once a fearful political entity, a global diplomatic network, and a dispersed community of individuals capable of extraordinary courage. And that forces the question beyond the character of one pope. The files do not simply ask whether Pius XII was right or wrong. They ask what kind of thing the Vatican is. Is it primarily a moral authority, bound to speak clearly regardless of cost? Or is it also a state compelled to think in terms of survival, leverage, access, and consequence? In that sense, the debate is not only about evidence, it is about framework. Both sides are studying the same map of actions and inactions, but they are judging it according to different laws. Was Pius XII a failed moral witness, or was he a pragmatic head of state doing what could still be done inside a collapsing world? The disturbing answer suggested by the archive is that he was both, at the same time, and that is what makes the case so difficult. To understand the decisions made in the Apostolic Palace in those years, we have to understand the nature of the entity making them. The Holy See is not just a religion, and it is not just a state. In political terms, it is something sui generis, a category of its own. It has a double identity. It is a spiritual institution expected to act as the conscience of the world, and it is also a sovereign political body with diplomats, intelligence, assets, and the basic instinct every state possesses, the instinct to survive. And in the 1940s, those two identities were in direct conflict. The moral authority was pushed toward a public truth-telling that might ignite the world. The state was pushed toward protecting its people, its networks, and its ability to operate under totalitarian rule. Speaking clearly could be seen as moral courage. It could also be seen as political recklessness, inviting reprisals that might destroy the very rescue channels still functioning in secret. Remaining silent could preserve those channels, but it also ate away at the Church's claim to moral leadership. So the documents of Pius's pontificate are not the record of one clean decision. They are the anatomy of an impossible one. They show us a man and an institution trapped inside a paradox. Every action came with its opposite cost. Every choice carried a compromise, and the archive, in its cold and patient way, does not solve that paradox. It keeps it intact. It forces us to sit with the possibility that in some moments of history there is no pure path, no unbroken line between moral witness and practical consequence, only risk, judgment, and arguments that will continue long after the people involved are gone. That is the painful truth at the centre of this place. The secret is not that the Vatican was secretly evil or secretly heroic. The secret is that it was, and still is, a profoundly human institution forced to make inhuman choices. And that logic of survival, that grim balancing act between moral witness and institutional preservation, did not end with the Second World War. It became the defining strategy of the Church's next great global struggle, the Cold War. This logic of survival, this willingness to operate in the grey zones of human affairs, did not end in 1945. As the shadow of Nazism receded, a new one fell across Europe, splitting the continent in two, the Iron Curtain. For the Vatican, this was a new kind of existential crisis. Millions of Catholics were now living under officially atheist regimes, dedicated to the eventual extinction of faith. They became known as the Church of Silence, and Rome was faced with the same agonizing question it had faced a decade earlier. What do you do when confronted with an ideology that wants you gone? The initial response was absolute. In 1949, Pius XII issued a decree excommunicating any Catholic who professed, defended, or spread the doctrines of communism. It was a clear moral line drawn in the sand. But on the ground, behind the curtain, this ideological purity often translated into harsher persecution. Priests were imprisoned, church properties were seized, and the faithful were driven deeper underground. A loud moral witness from Rome could feel like a death sentence in Prague or Warsaw. The archive shows that by the 1960s the Vatican realized that condemnation alone was not a viable long-term strategy. It was a policy of slow extinction. So, a new logic began to take hold. A quiet, controversial, and deeply pragmatic strategy that would come to be known as Ostpolitik, the Vatican's Eastern policy. Its goal was not to defeat communism, not to win the Cold War. The goal, in the words of its chief architect, Cardinal Agostino Casaroli, was to find breathing space, a modus non moriendi, a way not to die. This meant abandoning grand pronouncements and entering the painstaking, often humiliating world of negotiation with regimes that despised them. It was a policy of 1,000 tiny cuts against the wall, securing the appointment of a single bishop, getting permission for a seminary to remain open, ensuring the supply of sacramental wine. Each was a small, unglamorous victory in a war of attrition. For decades, Casseroli, the Vatican's master diplomat, travelled through the capitals of the Eastern Bloc, a patient weaver of fragile connections. He was criticised from both sides. For hardliners in the West and for many persecuted Catholics, Ostpolitik was a betrayal, a morally questionable compromise with an evil empire. They saw it as weakness. But from the Vatican's perspective, documented in countless diplomatic cables and internal memos, it was the only form of realism that mattered. It was the logic of a state responsible for the survival of its people, even if it meant shaking hands with their captors. And this, again, is the central lesson of the archive. The documents of Ostpolitik don't reveal a secret sympathy for communism. They reveal the consistent, cold and patient calculus of an ancient institution playing a very long game. It is a logic that prioritizes institutional survival above all else, believing that only by surviving can it fulfill its mission. This willingness to engage in the morally ambiguous world of statecraft is the Vatican's most consistent and perhaps most uncomfortable trait. But the Vatican's diplomatic chessboard was not limited to Europe. For centuries, it had been playing another long, patient game in a different part of the world, Asia. But this European chess game, for all its intensity, was only one board. The Vatican has always played on a much larger map, and its memory, stored in the archive, is truly global. The story of its reach doesn't begin with satellites and air travel. It begins with a quill pen scratching out a letter to the great Khan of the Mongols in the 13th century, an attempt to speak across a chasm of mutual incomprehension. It continues with Jesuit missionaries who didn't just travel to the far side of the world, they attempted to translate their entire reality. The files from China, for instance, document one of the most audacious intellectual gambles in history. When men like Matteo Ricci arrived at the imperial court in the late 16th century, they faced a civilization as ancient and self-assured as Rome itself. To speak of God, they first had to learn to speak in the language of Confucius. They adopted the robes of scholars, studied the classical texts and mapped the stars. The letters and reports sent back to Rome, now sitting in the archive, are electric with this tension. They detail the so-called Chinese rites controversy, a furious century-long debate. How far could the Church bend to accommodate local customs? Could ancestral veneration be squared with Christian doctrine? For every missionary who argued for adaptation, there was a cardinal in Rome who saw only heresy and compromise. The archive holds the records of both sides of that fight, a deep, internal fracture over the very identity of the faith. Then there is Japan. The correspondence from the Tokugawa shogunate reads like a different story altogether. After an initial period of engagement, the reaction was not debate, but violent expulsion. Christianity was seen as a destabilizing foreign influence, and the response was absolute. The reports that trickled back to the Vatican, often smuggled out at immense risk, speak of crucifixions, of hidden communities practicing their faith in secret for generations, of a church of silence, far older than the one in Eastern Europe. Here, the archive is not a record of diplomacy, but a testament to its failure and to the terrifying resilience of belief in the face of annihilation. From the complex colonial and post-colonial landscape of Vietnam to the delicate negotiations with modern Asian states, the pattern repeats. Each file folder is a case study in the collision of a universalist faith with fiercely particular cultures. They show a Vatican that was often ignorant, sometimes arrogant, but always learning, always calculating, always adding new information to its central memory. These documents prove that the institution was never merely a European power. It was an information network, a global intelligence service with a theological mission, absorbing the world's complexities for centuries. But while the Vatican projected this image of strategic purpose to the outside world, the archives reveal a very different story within its own walls. A story not of grand strategy, but of human ambition, bitter rivalries, and deep internal fractures. From the outside, the Vatican often appears as a monolith, an ancient unified fortress of belief, speaking to the world with a single voice, under the authority of a single man. The diplomatic reports, the papal bulls, the global strategies we've seen, They all reinforce this image of a coherent singular power. But the archives tell a profoundly different story. If you listen closely to the silence of these shelves, you begin to hear arguments. The paper itself holds the echoes of a permanent low-grade civil war. This institution was never a monolith. It has always been a coalition of rivals, a delicate and often vicious balance of competing powers. The archives are filled with the minutes of 1,000 silent battles, conflicts between powerful religious orders, like the Jesuits and the Dominicans, each convinced their path was the only true one. Feuds between influential cardinals, documented in letters dripping with polite venomous prose. Theological factions that saw each other not just as opponents, but as existential threats to the soul of the Church. This isn't a modern phenomenon. During the Western Schism in the late 14th century, the Church literally tore itself in three, with three different men all claiming to be the one true Pope, each excommunicating the others. This was a crisis of faith, certainly. But beneath the theology, the archives show us it was also a raw human crisis of power, a story of ambition, loyalty and betrayal, played out by men who believed they were acting in God's name. The documents reveal an institution constantly struggling to contain the human nature of the very people who run it. The drive for influence, the protection of one's own, the fear of losing control, these are the timeless earthly forces that shape the spiritual institution from within. And this internal friction, this constant jostling for power, creates cracks. It creates vulnerabilities. Because where human ambition is the currency, other, more dangerous currencies inevitably follow. The battle for the soul of the Church is often fought with the weapons of the world. And nowhere did these internal tensions erupt more spectacularly in the modern era than in the murky world of Vatican finance, leading to a scandal that involved secret societies, the mafia, and a death that remains a mystery to this day. These internal arguments are often about theology, about the right way to interpret God's will. But sometimes the fractures appear where the sacred meets the secular in its most volatile form, money. This brings us to a chapter in Vatican history that reads less like a theological dispute and more like a noir thriller. It's a story whose most important files are almost certainly not held in the Apostolic Archive. The institution at the heart of this story is the Institute for the Works of Religion, or IOR. The world knows it as the Vatican Bank, and for much of the late 20th century, its public face was a towering American-born archbishop named Paul Marcinkus. He was a powerful, controversial figure, known for his blunt talk and his belief that the Church couldn't be run on Hail Marys alone. In the 1970s, Marcinkus's WWII became deeply involved with Italy's largest private bank, Banco Ambrosiano, and its chairman, a quiet, meticulously dressed man named Roberto Calvi. Calvi was known in financial circles by a chillingly prescient nickname, God's Banker. Together they built a vast and opaque international financial empire. But in 1981, the empire began to crack. Italian regulators found a $1.3 billion hole in Banco Ambrosiano's accounts, traced to a series of shell companies in Latin America, many of them linked directly to the Vatican Bank. A year later, the bank collapsed in the biggest fraudulent bankruptcy in Italian history. Calvi, facing arrest, vanished. 10 days later, on June 18, 1982, his body was discovered in London. He was found hanging by a rope from the scaffolding beneath Blackfriars Bridge. A grim, symbolic tableau. A Catholic banker under a bridge named for the Blackfriars, with his pockets full of bricks and cash. At first, the British coroner ruled it a suicide, but Calvi's family fought for years, insisting he was murdered. Decades later, a second inquest overturned the verdict, and Italian prosecutors formally treated it as a homicide. But who did it? Was it the Sicilian mafia, laundering money through the bank? Was it a shadowy Masonic lodge, P2, of which Calvi was a member? Was it someone silencing him before he could reveal what he knew? No one has ever been convicted for the death of Roberto Calvi. The Vatican has always denied any wrongdoing, stating its involvement was limited, and that it was also a victim of Calvi's deceptions. Eventually, the IOR paid a settlement of nearly $250 million to the creditors of Banco Ambrosiano, not as an admission of guilt, but as a goodwill gesture. This is a story where the truth is not buried under layers of Latin, but in the untraceable ledgers of offshore accounts, and in the silence of men who took their secrets to the grave. The official archive can tell you what a pope wrote to a king. It is far less likely to hold the minutes of a meeting between a bishop and a gangster. The Calvi affair is a brutal reminder that some of the Vatican's secrets are not its own. They belong to the shadows it sometimes walked in. But the murky, unresolved world of Roberto Calvi and the Vatican Bank is a story from another era, a time when problems could still disappear into the fog of international finance and plausible deniability. 30 years later, in 2012, a new crisis erupted, and this time the Vatican's response was not shrouded in shadows. It was clinical, public, and meticulously documented. The betrayal came not from a shadowy banker, but from inside the Pope's own household. The perpetrator was Paolo Gabriele, the personal butler to Pope Benedict XVI. He was one of a handful of lay people with intimate access to the daily life of the pontiff, the man who served his meals and helped him with his coat, and, as it turned out, the man who was systematically photocopying his private correspondence. Hundreds of confidential documents were leaked to an Italian journalist, revealing a Vatican consumed by internal strife, allegations of corruption, and bitter power struggles. The scandal was dubbed WWII. It was a portrait of an institution not as a holy monolith, but as a deeply human and deeply flawed political court. The reaction was swift and absolute. Unlike the Calvi affair, there was no ambiguity. Paolo Gabriele was arrested by the Vatican gendarmes. He was tried by a Vatican court. He was convicted of aggravated theft. The sentence was 18 months to be served in a Vatican jail cell. The institution was demonstrating that it was in fact a sovereign state, with its own police, its own laws, and its own prisons. It was a clear assertion of jurisdiction. The walls of the city-state were also the walls of its legal system. But the story did not end there. A few months later, just before Christmas, Pope Benedict visited Gabriele in his cell, and in an act of sovereign power that is also a key part of the papal role, he personally pardoned him. The butler was released and quietly sent to live with his family. The gesture was presented to the world as an act of fatherly mercy. And it was. But it was also something else. It was the final, perfect instrument of crisis management. The legal process established guilt and reasserted institutional authority. The pardon demonstrated mercy and brought the narrative to a definitive close. The scandal was cauterized. The WWII affair shows us the modern Vatican's machinery for handling a crisis when its secrets are forced into the light. It uses the tools of a state: investigation, justice, and finally, clemency. It's a strategy of damage control. But for most of its history, the Church's primary strategy was not damage control, it was damage prevention. It had a system not for catching leaks, but for ensuring that dangerous ideas never reached the public in the first place. The scandal of WWII was about managing an information breach, a reactive defense against secrets escaping into the world. But the archive reveals a far older and much more profound institutional project. Not just plugging leaks, but attempting to control the very source of the river of knowledge itself. For centuries, the Vatican wasn't just reacting to crises, it was engaged in a vast proactive effort to shape the intellectual reality of the Western world. And the primary tool for this project was a single, notorious book. It was called the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. For over 400 years, from the mid-16th century until its formal abolition in 1966, this was the official blacklist of Christendom. It was a simple, brutal, and astonishingly ambitious idea, a definitive list of every publication that a faithful Catholic was forbidden to read, sell, or own, under penalty of excommunication. This wasn't a recommendation. It was a spiritual quarantine. To understand its creation, we have to see the world as Rome saw it in the 1500s. A new technology, the printing press, was flooding Europe with texts, spreading ideas faster than any authority could control. And the most dangerous of these ideas came from Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, which shattered the unity of the Church. The Index was an emergency response, an attempt to build a great wall against what the Vatican saw as a contagion of heresy, a pandemic of dangerous thought threatening the souls of millions. But it quickly grew beyond that. Reading through the editions of the Index is like watching a battle unfold in slow motion over 4 centuries. A battle for the modern mind. The names on its pages are a roll call of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. Nicholas Copernicus, for his work decentering the earth. René Descartes, for his radical doubt. Voltaire and Rousseau, for their challenges to religious authority. Immanuel Kant, for his critique of pure reason. It was as if the Vatican was trying to place the entire intellectual project of modernity on a single, forbidden shelf. The institution wasn't just fighting heretics anymore, it was fighting a new way of seeing the world. To understand the Index, we have to look past the simple act of banning. The goal was never just to suppress books, it was to build a world. Every institution, every civilization rests on a foundation of shared stories and authoritative texts, a canon. The canon defines what is real, what is true, and what is sacred. It draws the map of reality. The Index of Forbidden Books was not merely a list of places you couldn't go, it was the tool used to burn all other maps, to insist that this one version of the world was the only one that existed. From inside this fortress of certainty, the logic was not malicious, it was pastoral. It was the logic of a shepherd who believes the world outside his flock's pasture is filled with poison and wolves. An idea, in this view, is not a neutral thing to be debated. It is a spiritual agent capable of leading a soul to eternal damnation. A book containing a challenge to dogma wasn't just incorrect, it was a contagion, and the duty of the Church, as it saw it, was to protect its flock, especially those least equipped to discern truth from sophisticated error. The archive is filled with the language of this duty, reports from censors written not with glee, but with a kind of clinical gravity, as if they were doctors diagnosing a plague. The true enemy, then, was not falsehood, it was ambiguity. The Protestant Reformation had been a brutal lesson in what happens when the monopoly on truth is broken. A single question, a single doubt, could splinter kingdoms and shatter the universal body of Christ. The Index was an attempt to make the world safe from questions. It was an engineering project designed to construct a reality without cracks, a faith without the anxiety of choice. For the ordinary person, this offered a profound comfort, the assurance of a single, unwavering, institutionally guaranteed truth in a confusing world. This is the mechanism, laid bare in the archive's records, of our central thesis. The institution hid complexity to preserve simplicity. It curated reality. It withheld the works of Copernicus, not because it was stupid, but because a shifting earth created a shifting foundation for man's place in God's cosmos. It banned the philosophers of the Enlightenment, not just because they were wrong, but because they championed the individual conscience over institutional authority. Each banned book was a complex truth, a difficult question that was deemed too dangerous for the simple faith of the millions. The protection of the flock required the ignorance of the flock, but like any rigid system of control, the Index eventually became unsustainable. Its end, however, was not the end of control itself, it was its transformation, but no institution, no matter how powerful, can hold back the tide of the world forever. The 20th century brought changes so profound, 2 world wars, the rise of mass media, a global questioning of all authority, that even the Vatican had to adapt or risk becoming a museum piece. The great internal reckoning came in the 1960s, with the Second Vatican Council, a moment when the Church decided to open its windows to the modern world. And in this new climate, the Index of Forbidden Books, that 400-year-old fortress against dangerous ideas, suddenly looked like an ancient and indefensible wall. In 1966, Pope Paul VI made it official. The Index was formally abolished. The announcement was a landmark. It seemed to signal the end of an era of censorship, a gesture of intellectual trust in the faithful. The blacklist was gone. Authors like Kant, Voltaire, and Galileo were, in a sense, finally released from their paper prison. It felt like a revolution, a victory for the freedom of thought. But in the Vatican, revolutions are rarely what they seem. One has to read the fine print. The official notification stated that the Index no longer had the force of ecclesiastical law, with the attached penalties and censures. This was true. You would no longer be automatically excommunicated for reading a forbidden text. However, the same document immediately added that the list retained its moral force. This is a critical distinction. The law was gone, but the judgment remained. The Church was no longer acting as a policeman, but it was still very much a teacher, telling its followers which intellectual pastures were safe and which were poisoned. and the function itself did not disappear, it simply migrated. The power to review, judge, and correct theological works was the historical mandate of the Holy Office of the Inquisition. By the 1960s, that body had been renamed the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, or the CDF, and it continued its work. The method changed. Instead of a public list of condemned authors, the CDF operated through a more modern, more discreet system. It conducted internal reviews of theological works, issued private notifications to authors, and published doctrinal clarifications when it felt a line had been crossed. This is how an ancient power survives. It doesn't abandon its core functions, it updates their operating system. The crude public power of the blacklist was replaced by the subtle internal authority of the doctrinal review. The goal was no longer to burn the map, but to quietly and relentlessly correct it, to ensure the official version remained the most authoritative. The power to define the boundaries of legitimate thought was not surrendered, it was modernized. But the Vatican's mechanisms for controlling dangerous ideas would face their greatest test with a danger that came not from books, but from within its own ranks, a crisis that would threaten not just the Church's intellectual authority, but its very soul. But the control of knowledge is not always about external threats, the ideas of philosophers or the discoveries of scientists. Sometimes the most dangerous truth is the one that grows from within, a truth that cannot be placed on an index or debated by theologians because it is not an idea, but an act, a wound, a systemic poison that threatens to dissolve the very moral foundations of the institution itself. This brings us to the darkest corner of the archive, to a story that is not about the distant past, but about the living present. We must speak of it with precision and without flinching, because it represents the ultimate test of everything the Vatican claims to be. We are talking about the decades-long crisis of child sexual abuse by clergy and the institutional architecture of its concealment. The scale of the tragedy is now well documented, written in the testimonies of countless victims whose lives were fractured. It is a story of profound and intimate betrayal. But for our investigation, the central question is not just about the horrific sins of individual men. It is about the response of the institution. When faced with a choice between protecting the innocent and protecting itself, what did the memory keeper of the Western world choose to do? What does its own paper trail reveal? This is where the archive becomes something more than a repository of history. It becomes a record of a catastrophic moral failure. The documents, the internal letters, the canonical reports, the transfer orders moving predator priests from one parish to another reveal a chilling logic. It is the logic of an organization fighting for its own survival. In these files, the language of pastoral care is often replaced by the cold calculus of risk management. The primary concern shifts from the soul of the victim to the scandal that would erupt if the truth got out. A child's trauma becomes a liability to be contained, a problem to be managed, a secret to be kept. Here, the core conflict of the Vatican is laid bare, the collision between its divine mission and its all-too-human instinct for self-preservation. How could an institution built on the teachings of Christ, on mercy and justice, develop a system that so consistently prioritized its own reputation over the safety of children? The answer, the archive suggests, lies in that same impulse we've seen before, the belief that the faith of the many is fragile and must be protected from complex, painful truths at all costs. But here, that impulse curdled into a devastating pathology. The tragedy was not just the abuse itself, but the cold, institutional logic of its concealment. A logic enshrined in the Vatican's own secret procedures. The systemic nature of the crisis poses a terrifying question. When a moral rot spreads through an institution dedicated to morality, how does the system respond? Does it seek radical transparency to excise the cancer? Or does it turn inward, trying to manage the disease in the dark, hoping to preserve the outward appearance of health? The archive gives us the blueprint for the second choice, and it is not a panicked, improvised reaction. It is a legal architecture. The key to understanding this architecture is a document reissued in 1962 by the Holy Office, the direct predecessor to the modern dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. Its title is Crimen Solicitationis, quote, 0. It's an instruction on the procedure for handling a specific grave canonical crime. A priest using the act of confession to solicit sex. To be clear, This text does not order or condone abuse. It is a procedural manual for what to do when an accusation is made, and the procedure it outlines is a masterclass in institutional containment. At its heart is a single, devastating mechanism, the oath of perpetual silence. According to the document, everyone involved in the case, the victim who reports the crime, any witnesses, the ecclesiastical judges, and even the accused priest himself, is bound by an oath of secrecy. The penalty for breaking this silence is automatic excommunication. The stated purpose was to protect the sanctity of the sacrament of confession from public scandal, but the practical effect was to build a soundproof room around a moral catastrophe. This was not chaos, this was canon law. The document moves the crime out of the realm of public justice and into a closed internal judicial circuit. It creates a system where the first duty is not to the victim or to the civil law, but to the institution's integrity and the secrecy of its internal processes. The goal was not to deny the sin, but to contain the scandal. In doing so, the system created the perfect conditions for the disease to metastasize in the dark, shielded from the light of public accountability. A priest could be found guilty in this secret court, moved to another parish with a quiet warning, and his new community would never know. The crime was handled, the institution was protected, and the cycle could begin again. This was the logic, internally coherent and externally a moral disaster. For centuries that architecture of secrecy held. The walls of canon law, the gravity of the pontifical secret, the deep institutional instinct to handle its sins in the dark, it all seemed permanent. But a system built for a world of quill pens and sealed letters is not designed for a world of fibre optics and 24-hour news. The turning point was not a single edict from within, but an explosion from without. In the early 2000s, a series of journalistic investigations, most famously by the Boston Globe's Spotlight team, did what centuries of internal dissent could not. They made the secret public. They took thousands of individual isolated stories of pain and stitched them together into an undeniable global pattern. The private suffering of victims became a public truth, and this truth was too big to be contained by any archive, too loud to be silenced by any internal procedure. The old logic of protecting the institution from scandal was shattered by a new, more powerful logic, the demand for public justice. What followed was a slow, agonizing, and still incomplete institutional turn. The archives from these years do not show a sudden moral epiphany. They show an ancient power grappling with a new reality, forced to learn a new language. The key change is visible in the evolution of its own documents. In 2011, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith issued a circular letter to the world's bishops' conferences. It was not a theological treatise, it was a set of guidelines, and buried within it was a quiet revolution. It stated that directives on reporting abuse must always be carried out in full observance of the prescriptions of civil law. Let's be clear what this means. After centuries of claiming absolute internal jurisdiction, the institution was formally acknowledging its subordination to the laws of the secular world in this matter. It was a seismic shift. The process, however, is not a straight line. It is a battle against the institution's own DNA, a struggle between the new language of transparency and the old, deep-seated habit of secrecy. The work is far from over. The wounds are far from healed. What the archive teaches us here is perhaps its most painful lesson. It shows us an institution being forced, against its deepest instincts, to evolve. It is the story of a sovereign body slowly realizing that its moral authority in the world is no longer absolute, but conditional. Conditional on its ability to face the truths it once sought to confine to the shadows. This painful evolution, this transition from internal secrecy to a forced engagement with the outside world, is not limited to the Church's moral failings. A similar, though less traumatic journey can be seen in its relationship with another great power, science. Of all the conflicts documented in the archive, the one between faith and science seems the most fundamental. It is the story we all think we know, a battle between the telescope and the altar, with Galileo as its eternal martyr. The Church, in this version, is the fortress of dogma, its windows sealed against the light of reason. The archives are seen as the tomb where inconvenient truths about the cosmos are buried. But this story, like so many others, is too simple. Because what if I told you that one of the oldest astronomical research institutions in the world is, and always has been. Run by the Holy See? It's not a secret. It's called the Vatican Observatory. It operates a state-of-the-art telescope on a mountain in Arizona, and its headquarters are in the papal summer residence at Castel Gandolfo. Its staff are Jesuit priests who are also world-class astronomers and astrophysicists, publishing peer-reviewed papers on everything from meteorites to the furthest galaxies. This seems like a paradox, but the archive reveals it's not. It's a correction. The observatory was formally refounded by Pope Leo XIII in 1891, and his official reason, stated explicitly in his founding document, was to show the world that the Church and its pastors are not opposed to true and solid science. It was a direct institutional response to the ghost of Galileo. It was an act of reputation management, a century in the making. The Pope understood that the accusation of being hostile to truth was a mortal wound for an institution that claimed to be its ultimate guardian. The observatory, then, is not proof that the conflict never happened. It is proof that the conflict was so damaging that the Vatican had to build a permanent, functioning scientific institution to heal the wound. It's a living monument to a lesson learned. It shows the Church grappling in real time with the expanding universe, trying to find a way to hold both the book of Scripture and the book of nature in its hands at the same time. It doesn't erase the tragedy of Galileo's trial, but it complicates the myth of a simple war. It reveals an institution capable of a long, slow, and deeply serious process of self-reflection. The archive shows the Church wrestling with the cosmos, but it also documents its long and often silent wrestling match with another fundamental reality, half of humanity: women. The Vatican's long war with science, its struggles with modernity, its internal battles for power, these are stories that for the most part play out on a stage populated by men. Popes, cardinals, kings, inquisitors, scientists, bankers, butlers. The history of the Church, as it is commonly told, is the history of its patriarchs. The archive, from a distance, seems to be the ultimate monument to this fact, a written record of male authority, passed down through an unbroken line of male hands. But this too is an incomplete picture. The archive remembers more than the institution always chooses to speak about. If you look carefully, past the papal decrees and the minutes of councils, you will find other voices, voices that were not just present but profoundly influential. Take, for example, a series of documents from the 12th century. They concern a German woman named Hildegard of Bingen. To call her an abbess is to say that Albert Einstein was a patent clerk. It's true, but it misses the point entirely. Hildegard was a composer whose music is still performed today. She was a philosopher, a naturalist, a physician, and a mystic whose visions were submitted to the highest levels of the Church for authentication. She was, without exaggeration, one of the great intellectual forces of her age. And this is not a modern re-evaluation. The archives prove she was seen as such in her own time. She was not a quiet, cloistered figure. She corresponded with emperors, like Frederick Barbarossa, offering him sharp spiritual and political advice. And most importantly, she wrote directly to the Pope. According to the records, when her work was reviewed, Pope Eugene III, in the 1140s, not only approved of her visions but officially authorized her to write and to speak publicly. In an era when a woman's voice was almost entirely confined to the domestic or the monastic sphere, Hildegard was given a license to teach the world, directly from the throne of St. Peter. What this file tells us is that the simple narrative of total patriarchal suppression is, again, too simple. The institution, for all its rigid structure, was at times porous. It was capable of recognizing and empowering raw spiritual and intellectual authority, even when it appeared in the wrong gender. Hildegard's existence proves that the Church's memory contains evidence of a more complex reality, one where powerful female agency was not just a rebellion, but sometimes a sanctioned and celebrated fact. The archive doesn't erase these voices, it preserves them, waiting for a time when we are ready to listen. And so the archive presents us with a paradox. We find the fingerprints of powerful women everywhere, in the letters of queens shaping European politics, in the theological treatises of mystics advising popes, in the financial records of abbeys run with ruthless efficiency by abbesses who were, in effect, feudal lords. The institution did not and could not function without them. Their agency is a documented fact, their voices are real. But this is where we must understand the architecture of the institution itself. The power these women wielded was a power of influence, of intellect, of spiritual charisma. It was not a power of office. In the rigid, hierarchical structure of the Catholic Church, true authority, the authority to govern, to pass binding laws, and most importantly, to administer the sacraments that are the very heart of the faith, flows from one place: priestly ordination. And this is the door that has always remained closed. This isn't an ancient, forgotten rule. It is a line drawn and redrawn with absolute clarity. In 1994, Pope John Paul II issued a short apostolic letter, Ordinatio Sacerdotalis. The language is unambiguous. Quoting his predecessors, he declares that the Church has, quote, no authority whatsoever to confer priestly ordination on women, end quote. He states this not as a disciplinary rule that could be changed, but as a foundational part of the divine constitution of the Church itself, something to be held definitively by all the faithful. This document is the key. It defines the invisible but unbreakable institutional ceiling. It explains the paradox of a church that can elevate a woman like Hildegard to a doctor of the Church, celebrating her intellect, while simultaneously barring any woman from the priesthood, the diaconate, the episcopate, the entire structure of sacramental governance. The result is a history defined by a profound and permanent imbalance, a history of visibility without jurisdiction. Women could be saints, scholars, prophets, and advisors. They could be the heart and mind of the Church, but they could never be its hands in the act of consecration, or its official voice in the act of governing. This rigid control over who is allowed to hold real, sacramental power stands in stark contrast to a different kind of power the public has always been fascinated by: the more fluid, speculative power to see the future. And this brings us to one of the archive's most persistent and controversial legends, a document that supposedly maps out the end of the world, one pope at a time. The architecture of power we've been exploring is, in the end, a human one. It's a system of rules, of jurisdiction, of controlled access. But for an institution that claims a divine mandate, there is always another kind of power that people look for: the power to see beyond time itself, the power of prophecy. This desire for a coded map of the future has given rise to one of the most persistent and popular legends associated with the Vatican. It's called the Prophecy of the Popes. The story goes that in the 12th century, the Irish St. Malachy was granted a vision in Rome in which he saw every future pope until the end of time. He wrote down this vision as a series of 112 short, cryptic Latin phrases, a list of mottos, each one describing a future pontiff, and the final entry on that list, the 112th, is not just a motto, it is an ending. It describes the final pope, Petrus Romanus, Peter the Roman, who will feed his flock through many tribulations, after which the seven-hilled city will be destroyed, and the dreadful judge will judge his people. For centuries this has been an object of fascination, and today the interest is more intense than ever. Because according to the prophecy's timeline, Pope Francis is believed to be the pope who precedes this final apocalyptic figure. It's a perfect story, a secret timeline, a hidden destiny, ticking away in the heart of the Church, the ultimate secret. And yet, if you search the 85 kilometers of shelves in the Apostolic Archive for this foundational document, you will not find it. Because the story of this prophecy is not one of divine revelation, but of very human ambition. According to mainstream historical scholarship, the Prophecy of the Popes is a 16th century forgery. It doesn't appear in any known document before 1595, when it was published by a Benedictine historian. The evidence for this is simple and damning. The prophecies for the popes who reigned before 1590 are often strikingly accurate, frequently alluding to their family names, birthplaces, or personal coats of arms. But for the popes who reigned after 1590, the descriptions become hopelessly vague and can only be made to fit through creative interpretation. It's the classic signature of a prophecy written after the fact. The consensus among historians is that the document was likely created in 1590 to influence the papal conclave of that year, perhaps to promote the candidacy of a specific cardinal. It was a piece of political propaganda dressed in the robes of divine foresight. The Malachy prophecy, then, is not a secret of the Vatican. It's a secret about us. It reveals our deep-seated need for narrative, for patterns, and for a history that has a clear, coded destination. The real archive, however, offers something far more unsettling. Not a clean line to the end of time, but the tangled, unpredictable, and profoundly human record of how we got to now. The desire for a key, for a secret map, is profoundly human. A prophecy like Malachi's is seductive not because it's plausible, but because it's simple. It offers the comfort of a pre-written script. The idea that history is a locked room and all we need is to find the right code to understand its final act. It promises that beneath the chaos of human affairs, there is a clean, straight line leading to a known end. We look to the archives for this key, expecting to find a document that explains everything, that reveals the hidden engine driving the world. But the archive's most profound lesson is that there is no key. There is no single, clean narrative. The 85 kilometers of shelves do not hold a secret script. They hold the evidence that no such script exists. What they contain is the opposite of simplicity. They contain the raw, chaotic, contradictory source code of human decision-making. A desperate plea for funds from a missionary on one page, and a cold calculation of diplomatic advantage on the next. A transcript of a heresy trial filled with genuine theological terror, filed next to a report on grain prices in a papal state. A letter of profound spiritual guidance. And a ledger detailing the sale of church offices. This is the true value of this immense memory. It doesn't give us the end of the story. It shows us in excruciating detail how stories are made, unmade, and remade. Its ultimate secret is not a fact that has been hidden, but a process that is always happening. The constant, agonizing human effort to build a fortress of divine certainty on the shifting sands of political reality, economic necessity, and personal fallibility. The archive doesn't contain the one final truth. It contains the raw material from which millions of truths, official, personal, political, and heretical, have been built and fought over for centuries. It reveals history not as a revelation, but as an argument. So, after travelling through 700 years of history, from the ashes of the Templars to the digital leaks of the modern day, what have we found? What is the ultimate secret of the Vatican's archive? So where does that leave us? We came looking for a single shattering secret, a final document that would explain everything. Instead, we have found 100 smaller, more human truths scattered across centuries. We've seen a Pope, Clement V, too politically weak to save the Templars from a greedy king, and an institution that hid the evidence of that weakness for 700 years. We've walked through the grey twilight of Pius XII's choices, where the brutal math of diplomacy overshadowed the clarity of moral witness. We have sifted through the evidence of internal rot, of financial corruption and personal betrayal that shows the men of God are in the end still men. We've stood before the great intellectual firewall of the Index, an admission that the institution feared the free wilderness of human thought more than it trusted the resilience of its own truth. And we have heard the powerful voices of women, present and essential, yet formally locked out from the chambers of ultimate authority. There is a pattern here, and it is the key. In every one of these cases, the thing being hidden was not a simple, diabolical conspiracy. It was something far more corrosive to the institution's ideal of itself. It was the truth of its own complexity, its own fallibility, its own agonizing, stumbling, painfully human history. The Church presents itself to the world as a fortress of certainty in a sea of doubt, a place of unity, moral clarity, and divine guidance. The archive, then, is the ledger of every moment that vision failed. It is the documented proof that the institution is not a monolith, but a fractured, arguing political body. It is the raw data showing that its moral choices were often not clear revelations, but desperate calculations. It is the paper trail of its profound and eternal struggle with the messiness of being human. This is the secret. The archive's primary function is not to hide evil from the world, but to protect the faithful from cognitive dissonance. It is a defense mechanism built to shield the simple, powerful story of faith from the complicated, contradictory, and often embarrassing story of the institution that carries it. It is a record of an impossible fight, the attempt to manage a divine mission using flawed human beings as its instruments. The archive is the place where the divine ideal is audited against human reality, and the books never, ever balance. We have come to the end of our search, and the final uncomfortable truth is that there is no final uncomfortable truth. There is no single document, no ultimate key that unlocks the Vatican. The 85 kilometers of shelves do not converge on one secret, but diverge into a million complex, often contradictory human realities. The archive is not a pyramid pointing to a hidden chamber. It is a labyrinth, and this reveals its true purpose. For a long time, it was easy to believe a romantic idea, that the archive holds the truth in trust, waiting patiently until humanity is mature enough to understand its difficult lessons, that it is a wise, paternal guardian of our collective memory. But the evidence suggests something more active and more profound. An archive is not a passive storeroom. It is an instrument of power. It doesn't just preserve the past, it controls the past's access to the present. The decision to open the files of a pontificate, like that of Pius XII in 2020, is not an act of historical destiny. It is an act of institutional governance. Truth is not released when the world is ready for it. It is released when the institution believes it has crafted the right story, the right frame, to contain it. This is not a place of storage. This is a place of mediated memory, of controlled disclosure. So what is the secret that requires such a vast and sophisticated machine of containment? After all this, the answer is almost painfully simple. The greatest secret of the Vatican is not a conspiracy against the world, it is the truth about itself. The archive's most heavily guarded treasure is the raw, unedited, and undeniable evidence of the institution's own humanity. The fear in a pope's letter as armies march on Rome, the petty jealousies in a cardinal's diary, the cold, bureaucratic calculus that weighed souls against survival, the tremor in the hand of an inquisitor, the doubt, the ambition, the compromise, the moments of genuine grace, and the long seasons of moral failure. The Vatican hides this not because it is evil, but because it is human, and the core promise of the institution is to be something more, a bridge to the divine, a vessel of absolute certainty in a chaotic world. The archive then is the ledger of that impossible mandate. It is the exhaustive 1,200-year-long record of fallible, frightened, and hopeful human beings attempting to manage a divine idea. And that is a truth more complex, more unsettling, and more profound than any conspiracy. The ultimate secret, hidden in plain sight on every dusty page, is the reflection of the institution itself, and the knowledge that the vessel carrying the light was made of clay all along.